The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Matt Ridley, the science writer, journalist, and businessman. You spent 9 years as science editor for The Economist and are best known for writing about scientific discovery, the environment, and the economy. You served in the House of Lords from 2013 to 21 and are a fellow at the Royal Society of Literature and the Academy of Medical Sciences and an honorary member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. As an author, your books include The Red Queen, Genome, and The Rational Optimist, which have sold over 1 million copies and been translated into 31 languages. Your latest book, Viral, The Search for the Origin of COVID-19, co-authored with Alina Chan, explores how a leak from a laboratory in Wuhan is the most likely source of the virus. You believe it is vitally important that we understand how the pandemic began and that it requires urgent investigation, something mainstream scientists, journalists, and politicians have been reluctant to do. Matt, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much, Brian. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you here. I think I want to start off with a quote from you, and you said, quote, "The saga will forever punctuate the history of humanity. Has led to the deaths of millions of people, sickened hundreds of millions, and dramatically changed the lives of almost every person on the planet." You go on to say, if we don't find out how this pandemic began, we're ill-equipped to know when, where, and how the next pandemic may start. We're almost 3 years since this happened, and I was wondering, maybe we just start, maybe take us back to 2020 and how you first even became aware that there was this virus out there.
Well, beginning of January 2020, I'm picking up the news reports just like everyone else. I didn't have any special inside knowledge about this, that there were people dying in Wuhan of a new form of viral pneumonia. And there was speculation, maybe it came from a market very quickly. There's a market where a lot of cases were identified early on. So they actually used the diagnostic criteria. They said, have you been to the market? If so, you might have this disease, which makes it very difficult later to interpret how important the market was. And they're basing that on what happened in the case of SARS, because this is clearly a close relative of SARS. End of January, 23rd of January, the scientists in the Wuhan Institute of Virology published the genome of the virus for the first time. And that's a really interesting moment because they say it's closely related to a bat virus. Now, I was catching up on this. I hadn't followed the SARS story very closely. I knew that in the case of SARS in 2003, it had been palm civets that had infected people in markets in southern China, and they'd very quickly established a chain there with food handlers and animal vendors being infected early. So I assumed that we were seeing the same sort of picture here. But the fact that it was bats, which they eventually had found out a few years ago that SARS originally came from bats, it made sense. The SARS-like coronaviruses are all, as far as we can make out, naturally resident in horseshoe bats. No other kind of bat. There's about 100 species of horseshoe bats. There's a lot in China. It looks like you get sarbecoviruses, as they're called, SARS-like coronaviruses, originally from horseshoe bats. So yes, they said, the Wuhan Institute of Virology said, we found a closely related virus in bats. It's called RATG13. And it was previously discovered. They gave no link, they gave no reference. And I went online. I was researching articles about this topic, and I went online to find, okay, where did they find RATG13? Under what circumstances? In which bat? At what date is what I wanted to know. And I couldn't find any reference to that phrase in any online source at all. And so I wrote to the Wuhan scientists. They didn't reply. I wrote to some other people. They didn't know anymore. It was nearly 2 months before we discovered that the reason for that is that they'd been using a different name for that virus right up until the year before. And that may or may not have been intended to confuse us, but it certainly did confuse us and set us back, because once we knew the name they'd been using the year before, and it was a woman called Rossana Segreto who first spotted this thing had exactly the same sequence as a virus called RA4991. Once we knew that, we were able to find out where they'd collected 4991, and it turned out to be in a mine shaft in southern Yunnan, well over 1,000 miles from Wuhan, where there'd been an outbreak that had killed 3 people and sickened 3 others very badly. They eventually recovered. So this was a human. No, sorry, they didn't get the virus from the humans. They got it from bats in the same mine shaft a year later, a year after the outbreak. Well, this is quite important information. Because
that happened back in 2012.
The outbreak was in 2012.
Right.
The Wuhan Institute of Virology went back to that site 7 times over the next 2 years to try and find out what the bats were carrying, because they hadn't been able to identify the virus in the people, to find out what viruses the bats were carrying, because they suspected this was the first ever case of a SARS-like virus infecting people directly from a bat. That's what they thought had happened. We know that from a thesis at Kunming Medical University. So, so there's the start of an interesting trail here. What do we know? How do we know it? Why aren't we getting the full story up front from the Wuhan Institute of Virology? But at the time, I'm not even thinking it comes from a lab. And indeed, people were asking me, because they know I'm interested in molecular biology and infectious diseases and things like that, and colleagues in Parliament were asking me, I'm hearing that it might have come out of a lab in Wuhan. Is that true? And I'm saying, no, it's not true. It's definitely not true, because I've read this paper in the middle of March in Nature Medicine called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, which says that we can rule that out. Now, I don't fully follow the arguments yet. I haven't gone into the detail, but these guys seem to be serious virologists, and they're saying, no, it didn't come out of a lab. So that's good enough for me. Well, it shouldn't have been good enough for me. It wasn't good enough for me, because over the next couple of months, I start to dig a bit deeper. I find out this story about the Mojiang mine shaft, the connection with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the fact that they were bringing samples from bats 1,000 miles to the northeast, the distance from Miami to New York or London to Rome, it's not next door, and experimenting on them in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And then I found out the experiments they were doing on them. They were synthesizing viruses through a technique called reverse genetics. They were swapping genes in and out of viruses to test how dangerous these viruses were, etc. And then suddenly, in May of 2020, a paper appears online, a draft paper, a preprint, from a team of 3 scientists, one of whom was called Alina Chan, and she was the moving force behind this paper, saying, there's something weird about this outbreak that looks very different from SARS. This virus was very well adapted to human beings from the start. It didn't evolve very much in the first couple of months. That's surprising. Normally, if you've just jumped out of a bat and this is your first experience inside a human body, you've got to make some pretty rapid genetic switches to get good at infecting these new hosts called humans. Not least because in bats, this is an intestinal virus. In humans, it's a respiratory virus. So you're dealing with the lungs of a completely different, quite distinct mammal species. So you need to evolve like crazy to get good at this, right? To get infectious, to get, good at replicating and so on. This one doesn't seem to have done that. It seems to have been ready to go from the outset. Now that suggested to Alina Chan that we need to take seriously the possibility that it might have been the result of a laboratory accident, that it had been in human cells in the lab as part of an experiment, and it had jumped. At the same time, that very same week in May of 2020, the head of the Centers for Disease Control in Beijing, a man named George Gao, announced that the market was not the site where it began. He was confident it was not. Well, since then, we've had American scientists saying we're confident it is, but George Gao hasn't changed his tune. He published something again in 2021 saying, no, I really don't think it did start in that market. I think the market was an amplifying event. It was a super spreader event. Somebody went to the market and gave it to a bunch of other people. But we've looked for it in animals in the market and we haven't found it. We can't find an infected animal in that market. We can find samples on the doorknobs, on the countertops, in the sewage, things like that, but they're the human version of the virus. So those two things, the fact that it was well adapted to humans from the start, the fact that it didn't seem to have come from the market, and then behind this, the knowledge that it had actually, the closest relative had been collected a long way away but brought to Wuhan, made me reopen my mind about whether or not this might be a laboratory leak. And within a few months, I was collaborating with Alina Chan on writing this book, and both of us remained agnostic. We didn't know what the answer was. But as time went on and we turned up more evidence, we became more and more convinced that actually the lab leak is not only possible, but probable, and that it needs to be taken very seriously. And yet we hit a brick wall with the scientific establishment. They kept saying, no, no, nothing to see here. We don't want to discuss it. We don't want to have debates about it. This is, you know, a conspiracy theory or whatever. No, it's not. It's a distinct possibility.
And you have been inside uncovering and writing through and about the scientific community for decades. Did it surprise you to get that kind of reaction?
Well, I have to say, I'm a huge fan of science. My whole career has been about how wonderful science is. It's I think the human species' greatest achievement, bar none, is the knowledge that has been acquired through the scientific method. But I've been becoming gradually more and more disillusioned at the way the scientific establishment behaves like a church, resists new ideas, pursues consensus rather than debate, and more and more spends its time looking for confirmatory evidence rather than challenging itself, which is the definition, according to people like Carl Sagan. That's what science does. It's, it says, okay, nice idea. What evidence can we find that would disprove this idea? Not what evidence is consistent with this idea. And it seems to me that in recent years, science has become more and more like that. But I have to say, this episode, the last 3 years, have made me very, very disillusioned with science as an institution. Not with science as a philosophy, but with science as an institution.
Yeah, I have to agree to a certain extent. Now, in April of 2020, you wrote a paper for the Wall Street Journal, I think, talking about the concept of it being spread from a bat, and you kind of went into what was being told at the time. And then within a month or two, you were ready, or you wrote something saying, I'm now not sure, or it could have come from a lab.
Exactly that. I wrote an article called The Bats Behind the Pandemic for the Wall Street Journal, and in it I said, we can be pretty sure it didn't come out of a lab, but we do know it came from a bat, and the question is, how did it get from a bat cave, probably 1,000 miles away, to Wuhan? And within a month or two, I'm saying, look, there are 4 ways this could have happened. There are lots of ways, but there are 4 obvious ways. One is that there's some animal being sold in the market in Wuhan that has come from a long way away and that somehow was stored in a cave where it picked up a bat disease, etc., etc. And that's what happened in the case of SARS, as far as we can make out. The second is that there's a human being who lives in a rural area, goes into a bat cave to harvest bat guano as fertilizer. He catches a train to Wuhan, he infects people. That the vector from Yunnan to Wuhan is a human being. The third is that that human being is a scientist who's gone into that bat cave not to collect bat guano, but to collect blood samples and nasal mucosal samples from bats. And that's been happening on a far bigger scale in the last 10 years in Yunnan than it has in the previous 10 years. Why? Because they were on the trail of the original SARS. They wanted to find out where the original SARS came from, etc., etc. So they mounted a ton of expeditions to caves and mine shafts all over Yunnan to collect samples from horseshoe bats and to analyze the viruses they found in them. And they found something like 630 new types of coronavirus. And of that, about 100 were probably SARS-like coronaviruses. And of those 100, 9 were like SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID. All 9 came from, this is at the beginning of the pandemic, the 9 closest relatives of that virus were found in that one mine shaft in Mojiang County in Yunnan. And the only people collecting bat virus samples in that area and taking them elsewhere were the Wuhan Institute of Virology. You know, there's not a Beijing institute doing the same thing. There was one Beijing expedition early on, but it was mostly looking at other animals, actually, not bats. You know, it's not as if every city in China has this kind of lab. The only lab in China that is working on SARS-like viruses, SARS-Bika viruses, is the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or at least by far the biggest is that institute. So, and by the way, you know, you often hear people say, oh yeah, but you know, come on, the reason that lab is in Wuhan is because that's where the viruses are. No, the viruses are in Yunnan, they're 1,000 miles away. They have looked for SARS-like viruses in the bats around Wuhan, and there are horseshoe bats around Wuhan, and they've never found one. They've found other coronaviruses, but not SARS-Bika viruses, which are the kind we're looking for. So, you know, the geographical coincidence here is pretty striking, and I'll give you an analogy. In 2007, here in the UK, foot and mouth disease broke out on a farm at Pirbright in Surrey, and 13 miles down the road from that farm was the world's leading reference laboratory for foot and mouth disease virus. Is that a coincidence? Turned out, no, it is not a coincidence. You know, nobody said, well, that just must be a coincidence. You know, no big deal. There's probably nothing to see here. They said, whoa, this is way too close to that lab. We need to check if something's gone wrong there. And within a week or two, they had figured out that a contractor had been at the lab mending a broken pipe and had gone straight to the farm that then became infected. So we're talking here about a lab that was 8 miles from the market where the outbreak was first detected, in the case of COVID, and that is the leading lab in the world for working on these kinds of viruses.
So we were having conversations about this in April, May, and June of 2020, and asking similar questions. Everyone was confused, asking questions about masks, about distancing, about the economy, Great Barrington Declaration. Martin Kulldorff was on the show. And other people asking about if it came from a lab in Wuhan. Now, the first few got us taken off these tech platforms. Mentioning Wuhan would have gotten you sent to the loony bin at that point. I mean, that was almost code red. And again, I got an engineering degree from MIT. I mean, science as I know it is that we question things, we talk about ideas, we get them out in the open. I always used to joke, Matt, that the flat earthers on YouTube remained. The flat earth videos on YouTube were there. And if you want to watch them, you can watch them and you can debate them, and that's okay. Right. But anything asking questions about the virus or the origin virus was silenced. And the reason I bring it up is because in your investigation, there's a lot of powers involved here, from the Chinese Communist government to Fauci in America and pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. So how does this unfold? And this becomes very not about science very quickly, right?
That's true. Alina's a practicing scientist. I've been a journalist most of my career, although I started as a scientist. We brought different skills to this. She could, interrogate the science in great depth, and I, to some extent, was interested in just the simple journalistic practice of following trails to see where they led. Now, what was quite interesting is that, as you say, turning to Western scientists and saying, please can you tell me what you're finding out about the origin of this new disease that's killing people, was pretty useless. There was almost nobody interested. There was a little bit going on. As you say, it was very hard to talk about it on social media. Twitter was an exception. You could talk about it on Twitter, and that turned out to be vital. Facebook was censoring this. But if you contacted mainstream scientists, and I did, I contacted senior people at the Royal Society and others and said, what do you think? And they would say, no, we can rule that out. So, well, why can you rule it out? Well, it's just been ruled out. You don't need to worry about the why. We understand these things, you don't. It's not quite what they were saying, but it wasn't far off. So the scientists were not much help. The journalists were not much help, with a few honourable exceptions. Ian Birrell on the Mail, John Sudworth at the BBC, who tried to go to this Mojiang site. Most journalists said, no, that's a conspiracy theory, we're not even going to investigate it. Well, if you're a sniffing newshound wanting to make a career, why not, have a go at this? It's a really interesting question. How did this pandemic start? So that was disappointing. And the science journalists, worst of all, they would just say in a very patronizing tone, you don't know what you're talking about. I work for Nature or New Scientist or something like that. And I can tell you, I've talked to my friend, Dr. Fauci, and he says no. Well, that isn't quite good enough. The point of science is you don't take arguments from authority, you take arguments from evidence, right? If you want arguments from authority, join the Catholic Church. That's the way it works. So the scientists weren't much good, the journalists weren't much good, politicians weren't much good, they weren't finding out very much. The spooks weren't much good. I mean, I had conversations with senior intelligence officials in the US who said to me in conspiratorial tones, we've just found out the following. And on one occasion I said, not only have I read that in the media, I've written that in the media. Is that all you've got? So that wasn't much help. The heroes for us of the story were what we call the internet sleuths. And these were a bunch of completely random people who got interested in this story and turned out to have the forensic skills to pursue rabbit holes in the internet and find out where they led. There's a guy in India called the Seeker. His real name is Jeet Ray, and but he goes under the name of the Seeker. He's quite happy for us to tell the world who he is in our book. But he's a young man in Bhubaneswar who, as he puts it, knows how to use search engines. Well, that sounds pretty simple. But what he means by that is he got hold of some login details for Chinese websites where academic theses were stored. And he found some goldmine information. He found these 9 viruses 8 of these 9 viruses that they weren't talking about. He found the thesis that described what happened to those 6 guano miners, 3 of whom died at the Mojiang mine, and so on. So then there's a guy in Spain called Francisco Ribera, who he's basically a professional auditor. He knows how to audit companies, right? And he knows that what you do is you look for missing invoices, to see whether or not somebody's fiddling their expenses or whatever it might be. So he starts to compile what he calls a big Sudoku, which is every serial number of every virus that the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.